My name is Umi Nur Idati Islami and my metric number is 1240665. Our group will present the case of Universe Township of Monrovia and International Transport Workers Federation. Now I will briefly explain the material facts of the case. The claimant owned a ship that was registered in Liberia and sailed under the Liberian flag. The ship later docked at Milford Haven, a port in the United Kingdom. However, the ship did not have a blue certificate which was issued by the defendant to indicate compliance with its campaign against flags of convenience. As a result, the defendant blacked the ship, meaning it was prevented from entering or leaving the port. The purpose of this campaign was to improve the wages and working conditions of seafarers working on flags of convenience ships. To secure the release of the ship, the claimant agreed to pay the crew's back wages and also make a contribution to the defendant's welfare fund. The claimant made these payments because it feared significant financial loss if the ship remained detained at the port. The welfare fund was established to provide welfare, social, and recreational facilities for seafarers, particularly those serving on flags of convenience vessels. After the ship was released, the claimant brought a legal action to recover the payment made to the welfare fund. The claimant argued that the payment was made under economic duress and that the welfare fund was an invalid trust, meaning the money should be returned. But on the other hand, the defendant argued that its actions were lawful under Section 13 of the Trade Union and Labour Relations Act 1974 and therefore the payment was valid and could not be recovered. Now, moving on to the procedural history. The case first came before the High Court, where the claimant challenged the welfare fund payment on the grounds of economic duress and invalid trust. Then the decision was then appealed to the Court of Appeal, and finally, the case reached the House of Lords, which had to determine whether the payment could be recovered on the basis of economic duress and whether the welfare fund was a valid trust. The House of Lords delivered the final decision in the case.
My name is Nurul Hanim Batrisha binti Muhammad Rosdi. My metric number is 1240686. Now, I will be presenting the second part of this case, which covers the legal issue, the ratio decidendi, and the final order of the House of Lords. The House of Lords considered two main legal issues. The first issue was whether the payment of $6,480 made by the ship owners to the ITF Welfare Fund could be recovered because it was made under economic duress. The second issue was whether the payment was held on a resulting trust, meaning whether the ship owners still retain a beneficial interest in the money after making the payment. Now that we have identified the legal issues, I will move on to the most important part of this case, which is the ratio decidendi. The House of Lords recognized that economic duress is a valid doctrine in contract law. Before this case, the law mainly focused on physical threats or duress to the person. However, this case confirmed that economic pressure may also invalidate an agreement if the pressure is illegitimate. The court explained that not every form of commercial pressure amounts to economic duress. Businesses often face financial pressure during negotiation, and this alone is not enough to make a contract voidable. Instead, the pressure must be illegitimate or unlawful, and it must leave the victim with no practical alternative but to agree. In this case, although the ship owners suffered significant financial pressure because their ship had been blacked by the ITF and could not leave the port, the court held that the ITF action were part of a genuine trade dispute aimed at improving the wages and the working condition of seafarers. Therefore, the industrial action was considered lawful and the payment was not made under actionable economic duress. The court also held that no resulting trust arose because the ship owners did not intend to retain ownership of the money once it was paid into the welfare fund. Having explained the legal principle established by the House of Lords, I will now conclude with the final order of the case. The House of Lords dismissed the appeal and ruled in favor of the International Transport Workers Federation. As a result, the ship owners were not entitled to recover the $6,480 that they had paid into the welfare fund. The court confirmed that there was no resulting trust and no actionable economic duress. In conclusion, this case is significant because it established that economic pressure alone is not sufficient to amount to economic duress. The pressure must be illegitimate and leave the victim with no practical choice but to submit. This principle continues to be one of the leading authorities on economic duress in English contract law. So I guess that's all from us. Thank you so much.
My name is Siti Zulaika binti Abdullah and my metric number is 1240623. The case that we be presenting is Tunku Hammam bin Tunku Sulong and City Car Plaza Senia Berhad, decided in the High Court of Kuala Lumpur on 4 July 2004. Next, the factual timeline. Firstly, the plaintiff agreed to buy a Lotus Esprit Turbo SE from the defendant company for 330,000 ringgit, a price that was meant to be inclusive of import and sale tax. Next, the plaintiff paid a 60,000 ringgit for a deposit and both parties signed a sale note confirming the deal along with the remaining payment structure apart from a bank loan and the balance due by a set date. However, the defendant later discovered that the actual price of the car, once import tax was properly accounted for, should have been about 770,000 ringgit. As a result, the defendant refused to complete the sale and instead refunded the plaintiff deposit. Left without the car that he had agreed to purchase, the plaintiff sued the defendant for breach of contract. Turning to the procedural history, the plaintiff commenced this action in the High Court of Kuala Lumpur, claiming damages for breach of contract on the basis that the defendant had refused to honour the sale recorded in the sale note. In their defence, the defendant raised two arguments. First, that the sale note did not amount to a binding contract, and second, a defense of unilateral mistake, arguing that the price had been wrongly quoted. The defendant also filed a counterclaim seeking 925,000 ringgit for losses. The matter proceeded to a full trial in the High Court.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Fatidi Nurjiha binti Taufik Ali and my metric number is 1240654. Now I will be presenting on the legal issues, court order and the ratio decidendi. The first issue is whether the sales note filled out and signed by the defendant's sales manager constituted a legally binding contract. And the second issue is whether the defendants could successfully rely on the defense of unilateral mistake to render the contract void. The third issue is whether the compensation should be based on the actual market price of the car or the cost of the replacement luxury car that he eventually bought. Now, moving on to the court order. The court ruled in favor of the plaintiff, and the plaintiff was awarded RM 213,000 in damages with 8% interest per year from the date of the judgment until full payment. The defendant's counterclaim was dismissed due to insufficient evidence, and the costs were awarded to the plaintiff. Lastly, for the ratio decidendi, the court held that the sales note was a binding contract because it contained comprehensive terms, including the purchase price, loan details, payment deadlines, and the signature of both parties. This showed a clear intention to create a legally binding agreement. Next, the court held that a unilateral or one-sided mistake does not automatically make a contract void under Section 23 of the Contracts Act 1950. The court also stated that to rely on this defense, the defendant had to prove that the plaintiff knew about the pricing mistake and deliberately took advantage of it. Since there was no evidence of this, the contract remained valid. Finally, the court held that the correct measure of the damages is the additional amount the buyer has to spend to purchase the same item or a reasonable substitute after the seller breaches the contract. That's all from us. Thank you.